When we think of the most terrifying regimes in history, one name usually comes to mind: the Nazis. The systematic, calculated brutality of the Third Reich is often seen as the darkest period in modern history. But there was another group during World War II that was so violent, so depraved, that even the Nazis, yes, the same people who were the architects of the Holocaust, considered their methods extreme. Enter the Ustaše. Led by a man named Ante Pavelic, the Ustaše turned their vision of an ethnically pure Croatian state into a campaign of horrific violence against Serbs, Jews, and Romani peoples. Public massacres, forced conversions, brutal concentration camps, and sadistic executions, the Ustaše's brand of ultranationalism and ethnic hatred knew no limits, and their victims died in ways that even raised eyebrows in Nazi Germany. Their story is even more disturbing because they didn't operate in isolation. They were a puppet regime under the Axis powers, backed by the Nazis and fascist Italy, yet they wielded an unsettling level of autonomy. The terror they unleashed in the Balkans would leave scars that last to this very day. To understand the Ustaše, you have to start with the man behind the movement, Ante Pavelic. Born in 1889, Pavelic was a lawyer and a staunch Croatian nationalist during a time when Croatia was part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Now, like many extremists, Pavelic saw the multi-ethnic makeup of Yugoslavia as a threat to Croatian identity, and he despised the Serbs, who were the dominant ethnic group in the kingdom. His vision: an ethnically pure Croatian state, free from Serbs, Jews, and any other group that didn't fit his twisted idea of racial purity. In the early 1930s, Pavelic founded the Ustaše, a far-right, ultranationalist group dedicated to the violent overthrow of Yugoslavia and the creation of an independent Croatian state. The group's name, Ustaše, comes from the Croatian word for insurgent or uprising, and that's exactly what they set out to do. At first, the Ustaše were a fringe group operating underground with little power, but Pavelic had powerful allies. He turned to Mussolini's Italy for support, and the Italian fascists were more than willing to train and arm the Ustaše, seeing them as a valuable tool to destabilize Yugoslavia, which they viewed as an enemy. Mussolini's government provided the Ustaše with training camps where they could hone their violent tactics and prepare for the day that they would strike. But the Ustaše weren't just about violent action. They had an ideology steeped in extreme nationalism, racism, and truly deep hatred. Pavelic believed that the only way to secure Croatia's future was through completely eradicating or the forced assimilation of these various groups. One of the earliest and most notorious actions linked to the Ustaše came in 1934 with the assassination of King Alexander I of Yugoslavia. Pavelic and the Ustaše militants were heavily involved in this plot, which was executed with the help of the Bulgarian far-right group known as the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. The king's assassination sent shockwaves through Europe, signaling that the Ustaše were willing to use extreme violence to achieve their goals. The political instability in Yugoslavia during the 1930s only helped the Ustaše gain momentum. Tensions between ethnic groups in the region were already high, and the Ustaše capitalized on these divisions, promoting themselves as the defenders of Croatian identity against what they saw as Serbian domination. By the time World War II erupted, the Ustaše were ready. They had been waiting for their chance to take power. When the Axis powers invaded and dismantled Yugoslavia in 1941, Pavelic and his Ustaše were handed control of the newly formed independent state of Croatia. Backed by the Nazis and the Italians, the Ustaše now had the platform to put their horrifying vision into practice. And what followed would be some of the darkest acts of the war. The invasion and carving up of Yugoslavia had been the moment Ante Pavelic and his Ustaše had been waiting for. With the help of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, Pavelic was installed as the head of the newly created puppet state, the Independent State of Croatia, or NDH. At first, everything seemed like the Ustaše were simply following the footsteps of their Nazi allies. Like Hitler, Pavelic and the Ustaše wanted a racially pure state. But here's the terrifying part. While Nazi Germany pursued its genocide through a cold, bureaucratic efficiency, the Ustaše operated with a kind of raw, chaotic brutality that shocked even seasoned Nazi officers. The NDH may have been a puppet state, but that doesn't mean the Ustaše lacked power. In fact, they had an alarming degree of autonomy. Pavelic wasted no time in enacting his vision for an ethnically pure Croatian state where Serbs, Jews, and Romani people would be wiped out or forcibly assimilated, a campaign of ethnic cleansing on a horrifying scale. They called it the 3/3 policy. 1/3 of the Serbs in Croatia would be expelled from the country, 1/3 would be forcibly converted to Catholicism, and the final third would be exterminated. And the Ustaše were disturbingly efficient in their execution of this policy. Over just a few years, hundreds of thousands of Serbs, as well as Jews and Romani, would fall victim to this genocidal plan. One of the Ustaše's early acts of terror came with the Glina massacre. In May of 1941, Ustaše forces rounded up several hundred Serb men, herding them into a church in the town of Glina under the guise of offering them safety. Once inside, they were slaughtered, murdered in cold blood. The massacre at Glina was just the beginning. The Ustaše would go on to commit countless atrocities, many of them aimed at wiping out entire Serb communities. The terror didn't stop with mass killings. The Ustaše also implemented a brutal policy of forced conversion, targeting Orthodox Serbs for conversion to Catholicism. Those who refused were usually executed, and those who converted lived under constant threat, knowing that their conversion could be questioned at any time. The Ustaše used religion as a weapon, manipulating it to justify their atrocities and exert control over the population. As the Ustaše solidified their power, concentration camps were established across the NDH, where unspeakable horrors took place. The most infamous of these camps was Jasenovac, sometimes known as the Auschwitz of the Balkans, a place that would become synonymous with death and cruelty. Estimates of the death toll vary, with credible figures ranging from 77 to 99,000 victims, though some sources claim the numbers could be much higher. The camp was characterized by true savagery, with methods such as beating, starvation, forced labor, and mass executions being everyday occurrences. Unlike some Nazi-run camps, Jasenovac did not rely on gas chambers, but on hands-on, often sadistic violence, making it one of the most barbaric camps in Europe. As reports of the Ustaše's atrocities reached the Germans, even some Nazi officers began to express concern. It wasn't that they had a moral objection to genocide. After all, the Nazis were in the process of wiping out millions of people. But the Ustaše's chaotic, unrestrained violence was seen as counterproductive. Heinrich Himmler, one of the architects of the Holocaust, sent representatives to observe the situation in Croatia, and even they were disturbed by what they saw. One German officer described the Ustaše's actions as brutal beyond imagination, noting that their lack of organization and discipline led to unnecessary chaos that disrupted Axis control in the region. One example of this tension came when German officers reported that Ustaše forces were causing instability in areas where the Nazis were trying to maintain order. The indiscriminate violence, particularly against Serb civilians, was creating more resistance from the local population, making it harder for the Germans to maintain control. Even the Nazis understood that such rampant brutality could backfire. That isn't to say the Nazis were horrified by the Ustaše out of moral superiority. It was simply a matter of strategy. The Ustaše's extreme actions were seen as reckless, potentially destabilizing the Axis grip on the Balkans. But despite these concerns, Hitler himself continued to support Pavelic and the Ustaše, valuing their loyalty and their hatred for the Serbs. The regime was an important ally in the region, even if it operated in a way that made the Nazis uneasy. Despite their extreme tension, the Ustaše remained key allies of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The Axis powers saw the independent state of Croatia as a strategic foothold in the Balkans, and Pavelic was more than willing to align himself with Hitler and Mussolini. But despite these concerns, Hitler himself remained supportive of Pavelic and the Ustaše regime. Why? Well, because Croatia's loyalty to the Axis powers was more valuable than their instability. The Nazis, they were pragmatic. They knew that as long as the Ustaše continued their campaign against the Serbs, one of the Nazis' key targets in the Balkans, they were a useful ally. The Germans needed to maintain control of the region to prevent the spread of Allied influence and to keep Yugoslavia fragmented. Mussolini's Italy, too, had a complicated relationship with the Ustaše. While the Italian fascists had initially supported the Ustaše, tensions rose over territorial disputes. Italy had its own ambitions to the region, and as the Ustaše's violence spiraled out of control, the Italians began to distance themselves from the chaos. Despite these tensions, the Ustaše were too valuable as a destabilizing force for either Italy or Germany to abandon them altogether. In the end, the Ustaše's alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy was one of convenience. While the Nazis may have privately questioned the Ustaše's extreme tactics, they were willing to look the other way as long as Pavelic kept the region loyal to the Axis. But this uneasy alliance couldn't last forever. and as the tides of war began to turn, the Ustase would face their inevitable downfall. While the Ustase struggled on until the end of the war, the wheels started coming off with Operation Vice, also known as the Fourth Enemy Offensive. Operation Vice was a major military operation conducted by Axis forces, including Ustase troops between January and March of 1943. The goal was to crush the growing Yugoslav partisan resistance led by Josip Broz Tito, which had become a significant threat to the Axis occupation in the Balkans. The operation occurred primarily in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Western Croatia, areas controlled by the NDH. It was divided into two phases, Vice 1 and Vice 2, and it involved coordinated attacks by German Wehrmacht, Italian forces, Ustase militias, and Chetnik detachments. The partisans, outnumbered and outgunned, engaged in fierce guerrilla warfare, retreating to the mountains and using the terrain to their advantage. Despite the overwhelming force of the Axis, the partisans managed to evade encirclement in a daring escape at the Battle of Neretva River, the turning point in the campaign. Operation Vice failed to destroy Tito's partisans, and instead their movement gained strength and legitimacy. The brutality of the Ustase during the operation, particularly against Serb civilians, further alienated the local population and drove more people to join the partisan cause. The failure of Operation Vice contributed heavily to the eventual collapse of the NDH and Axis control in Yugoslavia. As World War II progressed, the tides began to turn even further. The Ustase's brutal reign was now threatened not only by the advancing Allied forces, but also by internal resistance as Tito's partisans began to make significant ground. These partisans were a diverse, multi-ethnic group, and their popularity snowballed in response to the Ustase's genocidal policies, which had driven many Serbs, Croats, and others to join their ranks. By 1944, it became clear that the Axis powers were losing the war, and with them, the Ustase's grip on power began to crumble. The partisans, backed by the Soviet Union and eventually the Allies, mounted successful offensives against the NDH, and by early 1945, the Ustase regime was collapsing. Pavelic, sensing the inevitable defeat, fled Croatia as Allied forces and partisans closed in. Many of the Ustase leaders, including Pavelic, managed to escape justice by fleeing to countries like Spain and Argentina, where they were sheltered for years. Pavelic himself fled to Argentina, where he lived under the protection of Juan Perón's government. For years, he managed to avoid capture, but he was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt in 1957 and died of his injuries 2 years later. Oh no. Meanwhile, others who couldn't escape faced retribution. As Tito's forces reclaimed the country, many Ustase members were captured and tried for war crimes. Some were executed, others were imprisoned, but many atrocities simply remained unsolved. The worst instance, that came in the small town of Bleiburg in Austria, where thousands of soldiers and civilians from the NDH were slaughtered. As Allied forces advanced, they had sought refuge in Bleiburg, hoping to surrender to the British Army rather than face the Yugoslav partisans. However, the British forces refused to accept their surrender and handed them over. What followed was a brutal series of mass executions and forced marches. Thousands of Ustase soldiers, NDH officials, and civilians, including women and children, were killed or died from exhaustion, hunger, and disease during these forced marches back into Yugoslavia. The exact death toll is furiously debated, with estimates ranging from tens of thousands to over 100,000. Victims were executed without trial, buried in mass graves, or left to die along the way. The Bleiburg massacre remains one of the most controversial and politically charged events in post-war Yugoslav history. Today, it continues to spark debate and is commemorated annually by the Croatian nationalist groups, while others view it as a consequence of the atrocities committed by the Ustase during the war. The legacy of the Ustase's brutal regime left deep scars in the Balkans, and the ethnic tension they fueled would simmer for decades, eventually contributing to the conflicts that tore Yugoslavia apart in the 1990s. The fall of the Ustase didn't bring peace to the region. Instead, the end of their regime marked the beginning of a long, painful process of reckoning with the horrors that they had unleashed. The impact of their actions would shape the region for years to come, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and division. The story of the Ustase is a dark and unsettling chapter in the history of World War II that is rarely told. Their vision of an ethnically pure Croatia was carried out through extreme violence, ethnic cleansing, and sadistic brutality that shocked even the Nazis. Yet despite their efforts to reshape the Balkans through terror, the Ustase couldn't hold on to power. As the Axis powers crumbled under the weight of the Allied advance, so too did the Ustase regime. Their leaders fled, For many, justice was incomplete, and the horrors they committed left a scar on the region. These historical wounds resurfaced as Yugoslavia began to disintegrate in the early 1990s. Croatian nationalists seeking independence from the collapsing Yugoslav Federation were often accused by Serbian leaders of resurrecting Ustaše ideology despite the long-defunct movement. Serbian propaganda under Slobodan Milosevic used the memory of Ustaše atrocities to rally support among Serbs, particularly in Croatia and Bosnia, painting the Croats as fascists intent on reviving World War II-era violence. The memory of Ustaše crimes was used to justify retaliatory violence, leading to widespread atrocities during the 1990s wars, including ethnic cleansing and genocide, particularly in Bosnia and Croatia. The Ustaše became a powerful and divisive symbol, reigniting ethnic hatred in the region and contributing to the devastating wars that followed. The Ustaše wasn't just a story of another fascist regime, it was a group whose violence crossed the lines even by the grim standards of World War II. Their actions would haunt the Balkans for generations to come, and their legacy remains a chilling reminder of what happens when hatred and ultranationalism are allowed to thrive unchecked. Thank you for watching.